I drove home for Thanksgiving and found an HOA party on my land. I drove 12 hours to spend a quiet Thanksgiving on the 3,000-acre ranch my uncle left me. What I found instead was an HOA festival, hundreds of residents, a locked iron gate, and a woman named Victoria Sloan telling me I was trespassing on my own land. Then she called the sheriff. Standing there while strangers stared at me like a criminal, I noticed something nobody else seemed to see. A boundary marker that didn't belong where it was. That single detail led me to a hidden notebook, missing records, moved property lines, and a courtroom battle that would expose a lie years in the making. And trust me, what happened when the truth finally surfaced was something nobody at that Thanksgiving celebration saw coming. If you enjoy stories about ranch life, property rights, and ordinary people standing their ground the right way, consider subscribing. There are plenty more battles of land, dignity, and hard-earned justice ahead. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the gate. It was the traffic. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours, crossing 2 states to reach the Montana ranch my uncle left me. 3,000 acres of timber, shoreline, pasture, and canyon land. The attorney handling the estate had warned me the property hadn't been visited much during the last few years of Uncle Harold's life, but I still expected what most inherited ranches looked like. A locked gate, a weathered fence, maybe an abandoned truck rusting beside a barn. Instead, half a mile from the address on the deed, I found a line of SUVs, luxury pickups, and polished sedans crawling down a road that should have been empty. I slowed my truck. Then I saw the banners. Thanksgiving at Timber Ridge. The words stretched across a stone entrance I had never seen before. Beyond it stood decorative lanterns, rows of parked vehicles, food tents, and a crowd large enough to fill a county fairground. For a moment, I honestly thought my GPS had taken me to the wrong place. Then I looked at the folder sitting on the passenger seat. The parcel map was clear. The lake beyond that gate sat on land owned by Harold Reed. Now it belonged to me. I pulled onto the shoulder and studied the scene. Music drifted through the open air. Children ran between folding tables. Volunteers carried trays of food toward a massive pavilion built beside the shoreline. Everything looked permanent, expensive, established, and absolutely none of it should have existed. I stepped out of the truck. The cold air hit my face, but I barely noticed. As a civil engineer, I'd spent most of my career studying maps, easements, and land use disputes. One glance told me millions of dollars had been invested beyond that gate. Someone had built roads. Someone had poured concrete. Someone had developed lakefront property on land listed in my family's deed. A man wearing a yellow security vest noticed me approaching. He walked over with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged there. "Afternoon," he said. "Residents enter through the main lane. Visitors park in the overflow lot." I glanced toward the lake. "I'm not a visitor." He frowned. "Which lot are you with?" "I'm not with a lot." His expression tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means I own the property." For the first time, the man looked uncertain. "The property?" "The ranch." I pointed beyond the gate, the lake, then toward the hills, the shoreline. His eyes narrowed. "Sir, Timber Ridge owns this recreation area." "No," I said. "My uncle did." A few nearby residents slowed down. People always pay attention when conflict enters a holiday gathering. The guard touched the radio clipped to his vest. "What's your name?" "Mason Reed." The radio crackled. The guard turned away and quietly repeated my name. I watched his posture change. Not panic, not fear, something closer to concern. Then he nodded toward the entrance. "Wait here." He disappeared through the gate. 5 minutes later, she arrived. Victoria Sloan. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew her type immediately. Perfect hair, tailored coat, expensive boots untouched by mud. The kind of person who had spent years giving instructions and expected every one of them to be followed. She approached without introducing herself. Mr. Reed? That's right. I'm Victoria Sloan, president of the Timber Ridge Homeowners Association. Her tone carried no warmth. Only authority. You need to leave. I blinked. Excuse me? You're creating a disturbance. I looked around. I was standing beside my truck. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't crossed the gate, hadn't spoken to anyone except the security guard. What disturbance? Victoria folded her arms. This is private community property. The words hit me like a slap. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. My uncle owned this lake for 40 years. According to our records, she replied smoothly, the HOA possesses legal rights to this area. Rights? Control. I stared at her, then beyond her. The pavilion sat directly on the shoreline shown in my deed package. There wasn't even room for doubt. The structure occupied land that belonged to my family. Show me. Victoria's smile tightened. Show you what? The document. The one that supposedly gives you control of my property. She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. Then she pulled out her phone. A scanned document appeared on the screen. Some kind of survey amendment. A signature sat near the bottom. She held it up for barely 2 seconds before lowering it. There. I frowned. That wasn't a deed. It doesn't need to be. It absolutely does. Her expression hardened. Around us, more residents had started watching. The holiday music still played. Children still laughed near the lake, but now people were paying attention to the argument at the gate. Victoria seemed to notice it too, and instead of becoming cautious, she became aggressive. You need to leave immediately. No. Her eyes narrowed. No? No. I pointed toward the shoreline. I drove 12 hours to visit property I legally inherited. Then I pointed at the pavilion. I'd like to know why there's a commercial event happening on it. The crowd grew quieter. Victoria's face flushed. You are trespassing. The sentence was so ridiculous I almost didn't respond. Then she reached for her phone. Fine, she said. If you won't leave voluntarily, we'll handle it another way. She turned toward the security guard. Call Sheriff Briggs. The guard didn't hesitate. He made the call immediately. A murmur passed through the crowd. Some residents looked uncomfortable. Others looked pleased, as if they were watching an unwanted intruder finally get removed. I stood there in silence. The strange part wasn't that Victoria called the sheriff. The strange part was how confident she seemed. She wasn't bluffing. She genuinely believed she had authority over land listed in my family's deed. That realization bothered me more than the accusation itself, because confidence like that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of believing a story, years of paperwork, years of people agreeing with you. Victoria folded her arms again. You should have left when I asked. I met her gaze. You should have checked who owned the lake. Her jaw tightened. Neither of us spoke after that. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's SUV appeared at the far end of the road. As residents stepped aside to watch, Sheriff Nolan Briggs pulled up beside the gate. And for the first time since arriving, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Somehow, somewhere, somebody had convinced an entire community that my family's land belonged to them. The question was why, and as Sheriff Briggs stepped out of his vehicle and looked from me to Victoria Sloan, I had a feeling the answer was buried a lot deeper than a Thanksgiving festival. Briggs listened to Victoria first. She talked fast, confident, prepared. According to her, Timber Ridge had maintained the lakefront for years. The HOA had invested millions into community improvements. The land dispute was already settled. I was simply a disruptive outsider, refusing to accept reality. Then he turned to me. "You the one claiming ownership?" "I'm not claiming it," I said. I opened the folder from my passenger seat and handed him the estate paperwork. "I inherited it." Briggs studied the documents for a few moments. His expression didn't change. "Do you have a certified deed with you?" "No." "Then this isn't something I can decide at a gate." Victoria immediately stepped forward. "Exactly." She pointed toward the festival grounds. "We have hundreds of residents here. He's disrupting a private event." I watched Briggs carefully. Years in engineering had taught me something useful. The person with authority often reveals more through hesitation than through words. The sheriff wasn't agreeing with her. He wasn't agreeing with me either. He was buying time. Finally, he handed my paperwork back. "This is a civil dispute." Victoria looked pleased. I wasn't. Civil disputes took time, and people willing to build pavilions on somebody else's lakefront usually had a head start. Briggs looked at both of us. "Mr. Reed, don't force entry." Then to Victoria, "And unless he crosses that gate, you don't have grounds for a trespassing arrest." Her smile disappeared. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. The sheriff tipped his hat and returned to his SUV. The crowd slowly lost interest. Music resumed. Children laughed. The Thanksgiving celebration continued as if nothing had happened. Victoria folded her arms. "You heard him." "I did." "Then leave." I looked past her one final time. At the pavilion, the docks, the shoreline, everything sitting where it shouldn't. Then I climbed back into my truck. Not because she won, because I needed answers more than arguments. 20 minutes later, I was driving north through the ranch. The second access road still existed exactly where the map said it should. No decorative stone gates, no HOA signs, just an old dirt track winding through timber and open pasture. The farther I drove, the more familiar the land became. I hadn't spent much time here growing up, but enough memories remained. A fishing dock, a ridge overlooking the lake, my uncle's cabin. When the cabin finally came into view, relief hit me harder than I expected. It looked tired, weathered, neglected, but it was real. Unlike everything happening down by the lake. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Dust covered nearly every surface. The place smelled like old wood, paper, and time. My Uncle Harold had never cared much about appearances, but he cared about records. Everyone knew that. He kept receipts for tractors he no longer owned, tax statements from decades ago, maps, letters, property files. If something happened on this land, Harold documented it. I started searching immediately. Kitchen drawers, filing cabinets, closets, shelves. The first hour produced exactly what I expected. Tax records, utility bills, insurance documents. Then I found the maps. Large rolled surveys stacked inside a metal storage tube. I spread one across the kitchen table. The boundary lines matched what I remembered from the inheritance documents. The lakefront belonged to the ranch, not the HOA, not Timber Ridge, the ranch. Every answer I found only made Victoria's confidence stranger. Why was she so certain? Who told her she owned that land? The answer wasn't in the kitchen. It wasn't in the office either. I found it in the bedroom. The room looked untouched since Harold's death. An old dresser stood against the wall. A faded photograph sat on the nightstand. The bed remained exactly as he'd left it. While checking beneath the frame, my hand brushed against something hidden between two wooden support beams. A notebook. Small, black, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. I pulled it free. Dust drifted into the air. The first few pages contained ordinary notes: fence repairs, equipment maintenance, water pump readings. Then I reached an entry written in larger letters. My pulse slowed. Harold rarely emphasized anything. This page was different. A single sentence had been written, underlined, and circled. If they ever move the canyon markers, they're stealing the lake. I stared at it. Read it again. Then again. The handwriting was shaky, older, written near the end of his life. The next several pages were worse. Not because they were dramatic, because they were specific. Harold had recorded dates, vehicle descriptions, construction activity, survey crews, equipment arriving near the southern shoreline. One entry stopped me cold. Saw men near marker 7 again. They left when they saw me watching. Another. Boundary stake missing. Another. Need to call county. Something isn't right. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The dispute hadn't started when I arrived. It hadn't started this year. Maybe not even last year. Harold had been tracking something for a long time, and judging by the notebook, he believed someone was changing the boundaries piece by piece. I turned to the final written page. Only one sentence appeared there. I kept everything. For a long moment, I didn't move. The cabin was silent. No music, no crowds, no HOA speeches. Just the weight of a dead man's warning sitting in my hands. Then another realization hit me. If Harold believed the markers were moved, then somewhere on this property, the original markers might still exist. And if they existed, they could prove exactly where the land began and ended. I closed the notebook carefully. Outside the cabin window, the distant lake reflected the fading afternoon light. The same lake Victoria Sloan had claimed belonged to her community. The same lake my uncle spent years documenting. The same lake he apparently believed someone was trying to steal. I looked back at the notebook. One question now mattered more than any other. What exactly happened to the boundary markers? The next morning, I started walking. Not the HOA side, my side. The land my uncle had documented for years. I carried 3 things with me: the notebook, a copy of the parcel maps, and a GPS unit from my truck. If Harold was right, the answers weren't sitting in a courthouse. They were sitting on the ground. The first marker location appeared on the map less than a mile from the cabin. I found it after 20 minutes. Or rather, I found where it should have been. The marker itself was gone. The coordinates matched perfectly. The map matched perfectly. But the steel survey post was missing. I crouched beside the empty patch of earth. The soil looked disturbed. Not recently. Years ago, but disturbed all the same. I checked a second location. Same result. A third. Nothing. By noon, frustration had replaced curiosity. 3 original boundary points. 3 missing markers. That wasn't coincidence. That was a pattern. And patterns usually meant intent. I kept moving south toward the lake. The closer I got, the stranger everything became. The hiking trail shown on HOA brochures wasn't where it should have been. The shoreline access path cut across land that belonged to the ranch. Even the decorative fencing around the recreation area extended beyond the property lines shown on every map I possessed. Then I reached the dock. For the first time, I stood close enough to really study it. Fresh lumber, new pilings, modern electrical hookups. Whoever built it hadn't invested a few $1,000s. They'd invested hundreds of thousands, possibly more. The structure stretched confidently into water they clearly believed belonged to them. I took photographs from every angle. Measurements, coordinates, landmarks. If this ended up in court, I wanted a record of everything. As I worked, voices drifted from behind me. I turned. 3 residents stood on the walking trail, a middle-aged couple and an older woman. All 3 were watching me. The older woman finally stepped forward. "You the man from Thanksgiving?" I nodded. Her expression softened. "My name's Martha Collins." Something about her tone immediately felt different from Victoria's. Careful. Curious. Not hostile. "You lived here long?" I asked. "Since before the HOA." That got my attention. "Before Timber Ridge?" She nodded. "I remember when this was all ranch land." I glanced toward the dock. "Do you remember construction starting?" The question seemed to make her uncomfortable. For a moment, she simply looked out across the water. Then she pointed toward a ridge overlooking the lake. "There used to be an old fence line up there." My pulse quickened. What happened to it? "They removed it." "Who?" "The developers." She hesitated. "Years ago." The husband beside her shifted nervously. "Martha," she ignored him. "I remember because Harold got angry." That surprised me. According to everyone I'd spoken with, my uncle avoided conflict whenever possible. "What happened?" "He showed up while crews were working." She folded her arms, told them they were crossing onto his land. "And?" "They told him the survey had changed." My stomach tightened. The survey had changed. Not the boundary. The survey. Exactly the kind of language someone uses when they want people to stop asking questions. "Did anyone check?" She laughed quietly. "No," the answer hit harder than I expected. Not because it was shocking, because it made sense. Most people trust official paperwork. Most people assume someone else already verified it. Most people never question a fence once it's built. Martha looked toward the pavilion. By the time residents moved in, everyone thought the lakefront belonged to Timber Ridge. But you didn't. She gave me a sad smile. I wasn't sure. Then she looked directly at me. "Now I am." The conversation ended when another resident called her name from farther down the trail. Before leaving, Martha slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand. "No one saw me give you that." I unfolded it after they disappeared. A contractor invoice, nearly 8 years old. Most of it meant nothing, except one handwritten note near the bottom. "Remove existing ranch fence before grading shoreline access road." I stared at the words. Someone had ordered the fence removed. Not accidentally, not through confusion, intentionally. And they paid for it. For the first time since arriving, I felt something shift. Until now, everything had been suspicion. Missing markers, notebook entries, stories. This was different. This was evidence, not enough to win, not even close, but enough to prove I wasn't imagining things. Enough to prove my uncle hadn't imagined them either. That evening, I returned to the cabin and spread everything across the kitchen table. Maps, photographs, the notebook, the contractor invoice. Piece by piece, a picture was emerging, and I didn't like what it showed. Because if the boundaries moved, somebody approved it. If the fence disappeared, somebody ordered it. If the lakefront changed hands, somebody benefited. The question was no longer whether something happened. The question was who made it happen. And as I stared at the shoreline photographs, another realization settled in. Nobody spends millions building pavilions, docks, and roads without professional surveys. Which meant somewhere, someone had drawn the line that turned ranchland into HOA property. The only way forward was finding that survey, and whoever signed it. The next morning, I drove into town before the county offices opened. The recorder's building wasn't much to look at. A few offices, a records room, and decades of property history sitting in filing cabinets and databases. Exactly the kind of place where big lies eventually run into old paperwork. I handed the clerk my parcel number. I need every survey, easement, boundary adjustment, and recorded amendment tied to this property. She typed for nearly a minute, then frowned. That's odd. My attention sharpened. What is? She turned the monitor slightly. There was a boundary revision filed 8 years ago. I felt my stomach tighten. Show me. The document appeared on the screen. Survey amendment. Timber Ridge Development Expansion. The filing showed a clean boundary adjustment shifting nearly 200 feet of shoreline property away from the Reed Ranch and into HOA-controlled land. The exact area containing the pavilion, the dock, the walking trails, everything. I stared at the map. This was approved? The clerk shook her head slowly. That's the strange part. She clicked through additional records. No deed transfer, no land sale, no ownership conveyance, no court order. Nothing. The survey existed. The legal foundation behind it didn't. Who signed it? She enlarged the bottom of the filing. A surveyor's seal, a signature, a name. The survey had been certified by a private surveying firm that no longer existed. Dissolved 6 years ago. Convenient. I paid for certified copies and left with a folder thick enough to expose a problem, but not yet solve it. By lunchtime, I was sitting across from the only surveyor multiple locals had recommended, Owen Hart. He looked exactly how a Montana surveyor should look. Sun-weathered face, work boots, no patience for nonsense. I spread the county documents across his desk. He studied them in silence. Then his eyebrows rose. Whoever drew this line knew exactly what they were doing. I leaned forward. What does that mean? Owen tapped the revised boundary. They didn't take random acreage. His finger moved toward the lake. They took the valuable part. The shoreline. The recreation area. The easiest access points. Every location capable of generating HOA value. Not a mistake. A selection. Can you verify it? He nodded. If the original markers still exist. My uncle believed they were moved. That got his attention. Moved? I handed him the notebook. He read the underlined sentence twice. If they ever move the canyon markers, they're stealing the lake. Owen closed the notebook. If that's true, this gets serious. How serious? He looked directly at me. Moving an official survey marker isn't a paperwork issue. It's evidence. The following morning we started searching. Not from the lake, from the oldest boundary points identified in the original deed. The first location took nearly 2 hours. Owen checked coordinates repeatedly, then stopped. There. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed rusted steel buried beneath brush and dirt. The marker had been ripped from the ground, not fallen, not damaged, removed. Owen crouched beside it. His expression hardened. This wasn't weather. He brushed away soil. The base showed clear signs of force. Someone had dug around it, extracted it, then discarded it. My anger began replacing uncertainty. Until now, there had always been another explanation. Clerical mistakes, bad records, confusion. That excuse was disappearing. We found a second marker later that afternoon. Same condition. Bent. Hidden. Removed from its original location. Owen spent another hour collecting measurements, running calculations, checking coordinates. When he finally stood, he looked irritated. Surveyors rarely get emotional, but this had clearly offended him. What is it? I asked. He unfolded a map. then placed two lines side by side. The original deed boundary, the HOA boundary. For a moment, I simply stared. The difference was impossible to miss. Nearly 200 feet, exactly where the shoreline became valuable, exactly where the recreational structures had been built, exactly where the HOA needed the boundary to move. They shifted the line, Owen said. By how much? About 200 feet. I looked toward the distant lake. The answer finally had numbers attached to it. Not suspicion, not theory. Evidence. Then my phone buzzed. An email notification. I opened it. Timber Ridge, HO. A notice of violation. Amount due, $4,250. Reason: harassment of residents and interference with community operations. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. I wasn't a member. I didn't live there. And they were trying to find me anyway. Owen read over my shoulder. His expression darkened. That's not confidence. What is it? Fear. I looked back toward the shoreline. The pavilion sat exactly where the false survey wanted it. The dock sat exactly where the false survey wanted it. Everything depended on that 200-foot shift. Everything. For the first time since arriving in Montana, I wasn't asking whether something illegal happened. I was asking who ordered it. Because somebody had removed official markers. Somebody had filed that survey. And somebody had convinced an entire HOA to build on land they never legally owned. The deeper we dug, the worse this was becoming. And something told me Victoria Sloan already knew it. The first sign came the next morning. Another email. Then another. Then 3 more. All from Timber Ridge, HOA. The language changed each time, but the message stayed the same. Back down. One notice claimed I had harassed residents. Another accused me of interfering with community operations. A third warned that legal action would be pursued if I continued making false ownership claims. False ownership claims. I stared at that phrase for a long moment. I was holding the original deed, the county tax records, the boundary maps, and somehow I was the one making false claims. I forwarded everything to a new contact Owen had recommended. Rachel Mercer, land rights attorney. By afternoon, she called. You weren't kidding. Her voice was calm, professional, the kind that made people listen. They sent you violation notices? 4 of them. Are you a member of the HOA? No. She laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Then they can't fine you. I assumed that. They know that too. That got my attention. You think they're bluffing? I think they're trying to create a paper trail. The explanation bothered me. Why? Because people planning a defense often start manufacturing evidence before the lawsuit arrives. I looked at the stack of notices on the table. For the first time, I stopped seeing them as threats. They were preparation. Someone expected this dispute to end up in court. Rachel agreed to meet the following day. By then, the pressure had already escalated. My name appeared online. A community Facebook group shared a photograph taken at the Thanksgiving gate. The caption claimed I was attempting to seize recreational land from hundreds of local families. The comments got worse. Greedy outsider, developer, speculator. One person accused me of trying to destroy property values. Another claimed I wanted to close public access to the lake. None of it was true. But truth wasn't the goal. Narrative was. And Victoria Sloan was building one. That evening I drove into town for supplies. Halfway through the hardware store, conversation stopped. Not entirely. Just enough. People recognized me. They had seen the posts, the gate incident, the HOA statements. Word traveled fast in small communities. As I loaded supplies into my truck, I noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. It wasn't there when I arrived. The windows were tinted, the engine running. When I pulled away, it followed, not aggressively, just close enough to be noticed. The vehicle stayed behind me for nearly 6 miles before turning off toward Timber Ridge. I didn't like it. Neither did Rachel when I told her. The next morning, we met in her office. I spread every document across a conference table. The notebook, the maps, the survey amendment, the contractor invoice, the photographs. Rachel studied everything methodically. No reactions, no dramatic conclusions, just careful evaluation. Finally, she leaned back. They have a problem. I raised an eyebrow. They? The HOA. She tapped the survey amendment. This document changes a boundary. Then she tapped the deed. This document transfers ownership. Her finger moved back to the amendment. One exists, then to the deed. The other doesn't. The implication hit immediately. A survey can describe land. A survey cannot transfer ownership. Someone had treated the survey as if it replaced a deed. Legally, it didn't. Rachel's phone rang. She listened for less than 30 seconds, then ended the call. Her expression changed. What happened? Interesting development. She turned her monitor toward me. Timber Ridge HOA had filed a public notice. The board was authorizing litigation against me for defamation, interference with community operations, and intentional damage to HOA reputation. I stared at the screen. They're suing? Not yet. Rachel folded her arms. But they're preparing to. I expected frustration. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Because people confident in their ownership don't spend this much effort attacking questions. They answer them. Victoria wasn't answering anything. She was escalating. Rachel seemed to reach the same conclusion. They're moving too fast. What does that mean? It means they're worried. The statement lingered in the room. Outside, someone had spent years convincing residents that the lake belonged to Timber Ridge. Now that story was under pressure. And stories under pressure often break in unexpected ways. Before I left, Rachel gave me one instruction. Stop arguing. I frowned. What? No interviews, no online responses, no public fights. Let them talk. That sounded backward. They're attacking me. I know. Her expression remained steady. Let them. I looked at the growing pile of HOA notices, the social media posts, the threats, the intimidation. Rachel pointed toward the evidence on the table. They're focused on noise. Then she tapped the deed. We're focused on proof. For the first time since arriving in Montana, I stopped reacting, stopped answering, stopped defending myself. And without realizing it, I started doing the one thing Victoria Sloan would fear most. I went quiet. No public responses, no social media posts, no interviews, no arguments at the gate. I stopped giving Timber Ridge anything to fight. At first, nothing happened. Then everything did. The HOA kept posting accusations online. Residents kept repeating the same story. I was trying to take community property. I was attacking local families. I was threatening a neighborhood that had existed for years. But without a response from me, something unexpected happened. People started asking questions. Questions hate silence almost as much as lies do. 3 days later, Rachel and I sat inside the cabin, surrounded by maps, tax records, survey reports, and county filings. The dining table had disappeared beneath paperwork. Rachel was building a timeline. Not a theory, not an argument. A timeline. Every document went into its place. The original deed, property taxes, construction permits, survey amendments, contractor invoices. The further we went, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA's story only worked if nobody looked too closely. A knock interrupted us. Both of us froze. The cabin sat far enough from town that unexpected visitors were unusual. Rachel glanced toward the window. A pickup truck sat outside. Old, local, not HOA security, not one of the black SUVs. I opened the door. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood on the porch. "I hope this isn't a bad time." I stepped aside. He entered slowly, eyes moving across the mountain of paperwork covering the room. "Looks like you've been busy, we have." Briggs picked up a copy of the survey amendment. "The county's talking." I wasn't surprised. Small towns always talked. "What are they saying?" "Half think you're crazy. And the other half? They think something doesn't add up." That answer interested me. The sheriff wasn't here officially. He was here because his instincts were bothering him. Rachel seemed to notice it too. "What changed?" she asked. Briggs hesitated, then reached into his jacket. He placed a folded document on the table. I found this while reviewing old permit records. My pulse quickened. The document was nearly 10 years old. A county planning review. One paragraph had been highlighted. Property boundary verification pending prior to development approval. I looked up. What happened to the verification? Briggs shook his head. No final confirmation attached. Rachel immediately understood the significance. Construction should have paused. Instead, construction happened anyway. The sheriff folded his arms. "I'm not taking sides." But his expression said otherwise. "I'm saying somebody approved a lot of expensive work before all the questions were answered." That was the first real crack. Not evidence of fraud. Not yet. But evidence that someone ignored a warning. When Briggs left, Rachel stared at the highlighted paragraph for a long moment. "That's important." "How important?" "It proves people knew there were unresolved boundary issues." The statement lingered, because it changed the story. Until now, the HOA could claim ignorance, a misunderstanding, a mistake. This document made that defense weaker, very weak. The following morning, another strange thing happened. The harassment stopped. No new violation notices, no threatening emails, no social media attacks, nothing. The silence felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. Then Rachel's phone rang. She listened quietly, asked only 2 questions, then hung up. "What happened?" She looked thoughtful. "Someone called my office." "Who?" They wouldn't say. That got my attention. What did they want? Rachel's eyes narrowed. They asked if we were still investigating the original survey. Every muscle in my body tightened. That's specific. Very. The caller had known exactly where the weak point was. The survey, the shifted boundary, the missing verification, the moved markers. Somebody was paying attention. Somebody inside Timber Ridge. Rachel leaned back. "Your silence is working." I frowned. "How?" "Because nervous people start checking whether you know what they know." The realization hit me immediately. For days, Victoria had been attacking, threatening, controlling the narrative. Now, someone connected to Timber Ridge was quietly checking our progress. The balance had shifted. Not publicly, not dramatically, but enough to matter. That afternoon, I drove past the HOA entrance. For the first time since Thanksgiving, nobody stopped me. Nobody approached me. Nobody challenged me. The gate remained open. The residence looked normal, but something underneath had changed. The confidence was gone. Word was spreading. Questions were spreading. Doubt was spreading. And doubt is dangerous inside organizations built on certainty. That evening, as I returned to the cabin, I noticed an envelope wedged beneath the front door. No stamp. No return address. No name. Inside sat a single sheet of paper. A handwritten note. 7 words. You are looking in the right place. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. I stared at the note. Then at Rachel. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she broke the silence. Someone inside Timber Ridge is getting scared. I nodded slowly. For the first time since arriving in Montana, it felt like we weren't the only people looking for the truth. And somewhere beyond the lake, beyond the HOA gates, beyond Victoria Sloan's carefully managed story, somebody had just decided to help us. The question was who. I got the answer 3 days later. The call came just after noon, a blocked number. I almost ignored it. Mr. Reed? The voice was older, careful, nervous. Who's this? A long pause followed. Then the man answered. My name is Daniel Pierce. The name meant nothing to me. Yet. I used to be treasurer for Timber Ridge HOA. Every distraction disappeared. I looked at Rachel. She immediately stopped what she was doing. Daniel lowered his voice. We shouldn't talk on the phone. Why? Because if Victoria finds out I'm calling, she'll know exactly what I kept. That sentence changed everything. We arranged to meet that evening. Not at the ranch. Not in town. A roadside diner 20 miles away. Neutral ground. Daniel arrived 10 minutes late carrying a cardboard archive box. The kind people use when they're moving offices. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Morally. Like someone who had spent years carrying information he wished he'd never learned. You Mason? I nodded. Daniel sat down and pushed the box across the table. I should have done this years ago. Rachel opened the lid. The first thing I saw was paperwork. Lots of it. Meeting minutes, budgets, invoices, email printouts, construction approvals, board correspondence, years of records. Daniel watched us carefully. Everything in that box came from HOA files. Rachel pulled out a stack of emails. Her eyes narrowed almost immediately. What am I looking at? Daniel folded his hands. The truth. For the next hour, he explained everything. The development hadn't started with bad intentions, at least not publicly. Timber Ridge originally planned a modest expansion near the lake. Then someone realized the shoreline itself wasn't inside HOA property. That should have stopped everything. Instead, it became a problem people wanted solved. Daniel pointed to one email chain. Victoria Sloan's name appeared repeatedly. So did several board members. One message caught my attention. Boundary clarification should be handled before construction continues. A board member had written it nearly 9 years earlier. Rachel flipped to the response. Victoria's response. Construction delays would create unnecessary costs. Continue as planned while survey review remains active. I felt my jaw tighten. She knew. Not everything. Not the full truth. But enough to know there was uncertainty. Daniel nodded. That wasn't the only warning. He handed over more documents. Independent consultants, contractors, even one attorney. Multiple people had raised questions. Multiple people had recommended further verification. The board ignored them. Not once, repeatedly. Then Rachel found something bigger. An invoice. Professional surveying services. Rejected. Reason for rejection? Additional verification unnecessary. The room went silent. Daniel finally looked at me. You asked who approved it. I nodded. Now you know. For the first time, Victoria wasn't hiding behind residents, or community improvements, or legal language. She was becoming visible. Not as a mistaken HOA president, but as the person making decisions, the person choosing risk, the person ignoring warnings. Rachel continued sorting through the records. Then she stopped. What is this? Daniel looked down. His expression darkened. Meeting notes. Internal? He nodded. Rachel began reading aloud. Several pages documented private board discussions before construction began. One entry stood out. Board acknowledges unresolved ownership concerns regarding shoreline parcels. Another. Proceeding under assumption, no ownership challenge expected. I stared at the paper. No ownership challenge expected. Not ownership resolved. Not ownership verified. Expected. The wording mattered. Because expectations aren't rights, and assumptions aren't ownership. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Most residents never saw any of that. I believe you. Victoria controlled information. His voice carried genuine regret. When people asked questions, she answered them. When board members asked questions, she answered the za too. Rachel looked up. Different answers? Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Usually. The deeper we went, the worse it became. Not because we found evidence of a mistake, because we found evidence that people knew there might be a problem and moved forward anyway. That distinction could change everything in court. As the meeting ended, Daniel handed Rachel a flash drive. No copies exist in HOA files anymore. What is it? Archived emails. Rachel took it carefully. Daniel looked directly at me. I don't know if Victoria committed fraud. The statement surprised me. Then he continued. But I know she knew there were ownership questions. He stood. And I know she built anyway. When he left, neither Rachel nor I spoke immediately. The cardboard box sat between us. Years of records, years of decisions, years of ignored warnings. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. This is huge. How huge? She tapped the meeting notes. Until today, we suspected they knew. Her finger rested on the documents. Now we can prove they knew. The distinction mattered. A lot. Because mistakes earn sympathy. Deliberate choices earn consequences. As we packed the records into the truck, I looked toward the dark highway disappearing into the distance. Daniel Pierce had just done something Victoria Sloan never expected. He opened the door from the inside. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, I had evidence showing that Timber Ridge leadership knew the boundaries were disputed before construction ever began. The only remaining question was what else they were hiding. The answer arrived inside a county archive box. 3 days after meeting Daniel Pierce, Rachel called me before sunrise. I found something. Her tone was different, focused, controlled, dangerous. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from her office desk. A stack of documents rested between us. Most looked old, very old. Yellowed paper, original filing stamps, handwritten annotations. Nothing impressive at first glance. Rachel slid one document toward me. Read the heading. I did. Temporary access agreement. The date hit me immediately. 32 years old. Long before Timber Ridge existed. Long before Victoria Sloan. long before any development reached the lake. What am I looking at? Rachel pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. I read it twice, then a third time. The agreement granted temporary access across a ranch road for maintenance vehicles servicing utility equipment near the lake. Nothing more. No ownership transfer. No shoreline rights. No recreational authority. No development authorization. Just road access. Temporary road access. I looked up slowly. Rachel nodded. Exactly. My pulse quickened. You're telling me the HOA never owned any of it? They never owned the lake. She pointed to the map. Never owned the trails. Another point. Never owned the recreation area. The implications landed all at once. Everything Timber Ridge claimed rested on a false assumption. For years. Maybe longer. The pavilion. The dock. The shoreline improvements. The festivals. The events. The parking lots. All of it depended on a boundary shift that should never have happened. I stared at the access agreement. A single forgotten document was dismantling an entire narrative. Rachel opened another file. This gets better. Inside sat correspondence between county offices from decades earlier. One letter referenced the same agreement. Another referenced renewal conditions. None referenced ownership. Every document treated the land exactly as Harold's records described it. Reed property, not HOA property, not community property. Reed property. I leaned back. For weeks we'd been proving what was wrong. Now we finally had proof of what was right. That distinction mattered. A lot. Wrong creates doubt. Right creates ownership. Rachel wasn't finished. She spread several maps across the table. Original boundaries. Current boundaries. Survey amendment boundaries. Everything aligned except one thing. The 200-foot shift. The shift created the illusion of HOA ownership. Without it, the entire development sat squarely on ranch land. I looked at her. What happens when we present this? Her answer came immediately. Their defense changes. How? Up until now, they can argue mistake. She tapped the access agreement. After this, they have to explain why they ignored their own rights. The statement lingered. Because she was right. Mistakes happen. People misunderstand documents. People misread maps. But once the access agreement entered the case, ignorance became harder to sell. Much harder. The following afternoon, we visited the County Records Division again. Not because we needed more evidence, because we needed authentication, certified copies, chain of custody, verification. Everything had to survive court scrutiny. The records supervisor reviewed the documents personally. When he finished, his expression looked remarkably similar to Rachel's. Confused, then concerned, finally interested. You found this in Archive Section B? Rachel nodded. The supervisor shook his head slowly. Nobody has requested these files in years. I believed him, because if anyone inside Timber Ridge had read them carefully, they would have known exactly how fragile their position really was. That evening, another shift occurred. Not legal. Social. Martha Collins visited the ranch. She wasn't alone. 2 other longtime residents came with her. People who lived in the area before the HOA expansion. People who remembered the old roads, the old fence lines, the old property markers. Their stories matched Harold's notebook almost perfectly. The same locations, the same timeline, the same construction period. For the first time, witnesses were beginning to emerge. Not just documents. People. Rachel smiled after they left. What? We're past proving ownership. I frowned. What are we proving now? Her answer came quietly. Intent. That word changed everything. Ownership established rights. Intent established responsibility. And responsibility was exactly what Victoria Sloan would need to explain. Later that night, I drove past Timber Ridge. The entrance looked exactly the same. The lights, the signs, the manicured landscaping. Everything appeared normal. But appearances can be expensive things to maintain, especially when they're built on assumptions. And now those assumptions were collapsing. Because buried inside a forgotten county archive sat a document nobody bothered to read. A document proving the HOA never owned what it claimed to own. The only question left was whether we could prove they knew it. And somewhere inside the growing stack of emails, meeting notes, and archived records, I had a feeling that answer was waiting for us. It arrived 2 weeks before trial. Rachel called just after sunset. "Get to my office." Her voice carried the same tone I'd heard when she found the access agreement. No wasted words, no explanations, only urgency. When I arrived, Daniel Pierce was already there. He looked nervous, more nervous than when he handed us the archive box. A small flash drive sat on the conference table. Rachel tapped it. Where did this come from? Daniel took a slow breath. An old board member. Current or former? Former. The answer was enough. Someone else inside Timber Ridge had decided they were done protecting Victoria Sloan. Daniel slid the drive toward me. Listen. Rachel opened the file. Static filled the speakers. Then voices. A private HOA board meeting. The date appeared in the file metadata. 8 years earlier. The year construction began. For the first few minutes, the conversation sounded ordinary. Budget approvals, contractor schedules, landscaping. Then someone mentioned the shoreline. The room inside the recording grew quieter, and everything changed. One board member asked a simple question. What if the Reed family challenges ownership? The answer came immediately. Victoria Sloan. You could hear her clearly. Calm, confident, certain. Harold Reed is old. Silence. Then her voice again. He's isolated. Another pause. If we complete construction before anything changes, community use becomes the reality people recognize. I felt my jaw tighten. The recording continued. A second voice asked whether the boundary questions should be resolved first. Victoria answered, "No." Then came the sentence that changed the case. If we wait for every ownership concern to disappear, nothing gets built. The room in Rachel's office went silent, because intent had just spoken for itself. Not ownership confusion, not misunderstanding. Intent. Daniel looked sick. I never heard the recording before last month. Rachel paused the audio. That's enough. But it wasn't. There was more. Much more. The next section documented concerns about surveys. Boundary verification. Legal exposure. Every warning was acknowledged. Every warning was dismissed. By the time the recording ended, nobody in the room doubted what it meant. The HOA knew. The leadership knew. Victoria knew. And now we could prove it. The hearing began 12 days later. The courtroom wasn't large, but it was full. Residents filled nearly every available seat. Some came to support Victoria. Others came because rumors had spread. Everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Victoria arrived with confidence. Expensive suit. Perfect posture. The same expression she'd worn at the Thanksgiving gate, as if control still belonged to her. When our case began, Rachel moved methodically. First came the deed, then the tax records, then the original maps. Owen Hart followed. The surveyor explained the 200-foot shift, displayed photographs of removed markers, presented measurements. Facts. Nothing dramatic. Just evidence. Then Rachel introduced the access agreement, the forgotten document that destroyed the HOA's ownership claim. The atmosphere changed immediately. People started whispering. Several residents looked confused. One even shook his head, because many of them were hearing the truth for the first time. Victoria's attorney fought every document, objected repeatedly, but the evidence kept coming. Then Daniel Pierce took the stand. The courtroom became very quiet. He described board meetings, warnings, ignored concerns, internal communications. Then Rachel displayed the emails, one by one. Questions about ownership. Questions about boundaries. Questions about risk. Everyone answered by decisions to move forward anyway. Victoria's confidence began slipping, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Then Rachel stood. "Your Honor, we have one final exhibit." The flash drive appeared on the evidence screen. For the first time all day, Victoria looked nervous. The recording started. The courtroom listened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Victoria's own voice filled the room. "Harold Reed is old. He's isolated. Community use becomes the reality people recognize." Each sentence landed harder than the last, not because it sounded criminal, because it sounded deliberate, calculated. When the recording ended, the silence felt enormous. The judge reviewed her notes. Several residents stared directly at Victoria. One woman covered her mouth. Another looked furious. Years of trust were collapsing in real time. Victoria suddenly stood. "That's out of context." Her voice cracked. Rachel didn't respond. She didn't need to. The recording spoke for itself. The judge looked over her glasses. "Sit down, Miss Sloan." Victoria slowly returned to her chair. The confidence was gone now. Completely. For the first time since Thanksgiving, she looked exactly what she was. Not powerful, not untouchable, exposed. As court adjourned for the day, Rachel gathered her files calmly. "How do you feel?" she asked. I looked across the room. At Victoria, at the residents, at the evidence table. Like the truth finally showed up. Rachel nodded. Tomorrow the judge would rule. But walking out of that courtroom, I already knew something important. No matter what happened next, Victoria Sloan could never claim ignorance again. Her own voice had ended that defense forever. The courtroom was packed when Judge Eleanor Hayes returned the following morning. Nobody spoke much. Nobody needed to. The evidence had already done most of the talking. Rachel sat beside me, reviewing notes she no longer needed. Across the aisle, Victoria Sloan looked exhausted. For the first time since Thanksgiving, she wasn't trying to project confidence. She was waiting. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the room fell completely silent. Judge Hayes opened a thick folder and began reading. "The court has reviewed the documentary evidence, witness testimony, certified surveys, archived county records, and recorded board communications." Every word felt deliberate, measured, final. She started with ownership. The original Reed deed remained valid. The property taxes supported it. The historical boundary markers supported it. The county records supported it. The court recognized the lakefront, trails, shoreline, and recreation area as part of the Reed Ranch. Not Timber Ridge, not the HOA. The Reed Ranch. I felt years of uncertainty disappear in a single sentence. Then came the second finding, the 200-foot boundary adjustment. Judge Hayes called it unsupported by lawful transfer documents and inconsistent with historical records. The survey amendment that had justified the entire development was declared invalid. A murmur spread through the gallery. Several residents lowered their heads. Others stared directly at Victoria. The judge wasn't finished. The evidence demonstrates that Timber Ridge leadership possessed repeated notice of ownership concerns prior to construction. Rachel didn't move. Neither did I. We already knew what was coming, but hearing it from the bench carried a different weight. The court found that warnings had been ignored. Verification requests had been dismissed. Construction had proceeded despite unresolved ownership questions. Then came the sentence that ended everything. The actions of Timber Ridge leadership were not the result of reasonable mistake. Victoria closed her eyes. Judge Hayes continued. They were the result of deliberate decisions. The room became completely still. The ruling hit like a landslide. All unauthorized structures on Reed property were ordered removed. The pavilion, the dock, the recreation facilities, the parking areas, everything. The HOA was ordered to pay substantial damages for unauthorized use of private land. Additional penalties were imposed based on the evidence of intentional misconduct. Finally, the judge referred portions of the case to county investigators for review of possible filing irregularities related to the survey amendment. The gavel came down. Just like that, it was over. Victoria stood abruptly. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to argue. Then she looked around the courtroom, at the residents, at the evidence, at the judge, and she realized there was nothing left to say. The truth had already won. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around residents instead of board members. That alone told me how much had changed. Sheriff Briggs approached as people filtered toward the parking lot. "You handled it the right way." I nodded. Didn't feel quick. Justice rarely is. He looked toward Victoria's attorneys. They built their case on assumptions. Then toward Rachel. "You built yours on records." Rachel smiled. Records tend to age better. The months that followed weren't dramatic. They were methodical, exactly the way justice usually works. Court-supervised crews arrived at the shoreline. The pavilion came down first, then the decorative fencing, then the dock. One structure after another disappeared, not because of revenge, because the court ordered restoration. The lake slowly started looking like itself again. The walking trails closed. The illegal parking lots were removed. Native vegetation returned. Even longtime residents admitted the shoreline looked different, quieter, more natural, more honest. Timber Ridge changed too. Several board members resigned. Meetings became tense. Questions replaced applause. Trust proved much harder to rebuild than a pavilion. Victoria Sloan resigned before the end of summer. No farewell celebration, no public speech, just a letter submitted to the board. And then she was gone. One evening, nearly a year after Thanksgiving, I walked down to the original boundary marker, the same one Owen Hart had helped recover, the same one somebody tried to bury. It stood upright again, exactly where it belonged. The lake stretched beyond it, calm, unchanged, as if none of the fighting had ever happened. Rachel joined me near sunset. "How does it feel?" I thought about that. The gate, the accusations, the sheriff call, the missing markers, the notebook under the bed, the survey, the witnesses, the courtroom. Then I looked at the water. "It feels finished." Rachel nodded. Not victory. Not revenge. Something better. Closure. My uncle had seen the problem. He'd left warnings. He'd kept records. but he never got the chance to finish the fight. Now it was finished. The lake had never changed owners. The land had never changed owners. The truth had simply taken longer to arrive than the lies. As the sun settled behind the ridge, I rested a hand against the old marker and looked across the shoreline one last time. The lake remained exactly where it had always been. The only thing that changed was that the truth finally caught up to the people who tried to own it.
If there's one lesson I take away from this story, it's that records matter and so does patience. Mason didn't win because he was louder than anyone else. He didn't win because he intimidated people or forced his way through the gate. He won because his uncle kept the paperwork, because he took the time to understand the facts, and because he stayed focused on the truth when it would have been easier to walk away. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is keep going one document, one conservation, and one honest step at a time. There's something comforting about that. Let's remember, all boundary markers, forgotten arrangements, and handwritten notes may sit unnoticed for years, but the truth has a way of waiting quiet until someone is willing to look for it. In the end, this wasn't really a story about lake. It was a story about honoring family, protecting what was entrusted to you, and standing your ground with dignity. I'd love to hear what you think. If you believe you would have stayed the course the way Mason did, type yes in the comments. As if you ever deal with an HOA dispute, a property disagreement, or a situation where paperwork makes all the difference, drop the word trusted and share a little of your story. And if you enjoyed story about ranch life, property rights, perseverance, and ordinary people standing firm through difficult situations, consider subscribing. There are plenty more stories like this still ahead, and I will love to hear you along for the journey.